Waking up, Xander's first thought was getting back to work. His second thought was visiting that blacksmith again to see if he could make some money. Anything to keep busy enough to ignore the crushing thoughts that had plagued him last night. He decided that he'd be best served by completing his own projects, and then if he had time and mana, try and sell his services to Smith. There were still a couple more days till he needed to leave. The tools were a bit easier to create as there was no etching involved. A crowbar was easy enough for him to make, as were the pitons, considering they were just a spike with a ring top. The hammer ended up being the hardest. He'd gathered some sticks from outside for wood to create the handle, but it took him 6 different tries to get the balance right, so that the head wasn't too heavy. He still had a few pounds of steel left over, but he decided to save it in case he needed it later, and just use created materials for his armor. Xander figured that the legs would be the easiest part to start with. He created some steel plates first. He formed one plate around the toe of his boot, then another further up, laced together with strips of leather analyzed from the griffin. He continued this process until he had a full articulated cover for his foot and ankle. For his calves, 2 plates, one in front and one in back, were made, with the front extending upwards and past his knee to protect the joint. A similar setup was used for his thighs as well. He decided that the plate carrier he used would be good enough for now on his torso, though he'd be etching some strengthening runes into the ceramic plates. Arms were similar to legs but scaled down, and he essentially just coated a pair of gloves he had brought in small plates for hand armor. The helm was going to be tricky. He felt that the ACH he had brought left him a little exposed. His neck was completely uncovered, as was his face. That could be bad in a hand-to-hand fight. He decided on something reminiscent of a great helm, but instead of a slit, he peppered the front of the helm with enough small holes to make it almost a mesh. He'd be able to see out of it, but it wouldn't be letting someone's sword in. The strengthening runes he'd be adding to it should offset the loss of rigidity that all the holes would normally induce. He'd have to give it a good test with his hammer to make sure before he relied on it. Now that the shaping was complete, and he had walked around a bit to confirm the fit of the armor itself, it was time to start etching runes. Xander went through the runes he knew from rune etching, trying to see if there was anything else he could put on his new armor. Ice, no. Fire, definitely not. Same for sharpness. Smoothness? Don't really see any benefit to that. Damn, guess hardness and a headlamp are all I got. Still better than nothing. He started with the helm first. He etched a single light rune onto the forehead of the great helm and followed it up with a riveted piece of metal that could be slid aside to expose the rune. 2 gathering runes seemed enough to power the light sufficiently. A few strengthening runes, especially around the facial mesh, and then the rest of the helm was filled with gathering arrays to provide as much mana to the strengthening runes as possible. The rest of his armor, as well as the front, back, and side plates in his plate carrier, were treated in much the same way. A few strengthening runes, and the rest of the space filled with as many gathering arrays as possible. Xander's test was simple and straightforward. He took each piece out back behind the inn and beat them as hard as he could with his hammer and crowbar. He couldn't make a dent, not even on the mesh for the helm. The few scratched he did manage were easily filled in and smoothed over with his skills, a success as far as he was concerned. He put the armor back on one more time and held up a polished steel plate to see what he looked like. It wasn't too shabby. The plate carrier was an odd look in the center, but the armor itself fit well, and the great helm was slightly intimidating. Thinking back on his experience with Estoc, Xander realized it was similar to the Being's helmet in style. The final touch that Xander could think of was to create and etch a small gorget to cover the gap between his helmet and the top of his plate carrier. He felt like some kind of techno-knight with the combination of past and future styles, the moly webbing on his plate carrier holding various pouches and tools, while plate looked like some kind of esoteric circuit board covered in runes and lines. Oh, he'd almost forgotten his bone shield. Soon it too was covered in a spiderweb of lines and runes, greatly increasing its strength. Around half the day had passed at this point, but Xander found himself still energized from the creative process. He removed his armor and then stowed it in his inventory, then began to head over to Smith's. It was time to try and make a little bit of money before he left to go on this contract. The next 2 days were filled with etching. Smith had been ecstatic to be offered the service, even if it was only limited to a few runes. Xander had even worked out how to create a sword that could ignite into flames along the edge when mana was actively channeled into a circuit, though the amount of strengthening and sharpness runes had to be reduced to make space. The smith's shop was littered with various pieces that had been etched, each of which he'd paid up to a silver for, depending on the size and complexity of etching it. He claimed that the additional properties provided by the etching would allow him to almost double the price of the wares. Xander was still a little fuzzy on the value of money here, but he didn't feel cheated by the pay. It wasn't a lot of work for him, just tedious to ensure it was done properly. And if he was able to stay at an inn for 5 days with 5 silver meals included, he figured that the 30 or so silver he'd managed to earn in those 2 frantic days would be plenty for the trail. Soon enough, it was time to leave. Xander had bought some preserved foodstuffs to supplement his remaining MREs and was feeling confident that he had everything he could think of for this trip. The alarm he had set on his watch blared as he awoke. He'd roughly calculated when dawn should be so that he could be up in time to get to the meeting point. But he'd misjudged and ended up a little earlier than he probably needed. Better than being late, though. Xander decided he'd just go ahead and get to the spot and wait. Xander did his best to exit the inn quietly while wearing an entire suit of armor. He was mildly successful, or at the very least no one deigned to shout at him for waking them up. Klimp was much more peaceful at this hour. Hardly anyone was out and about, and the road was empty. A few early risers had opened their shutters to let the air in or were leisurely opening their shops. It was nice to be able to take his time getting to the Eastern Watchtower. At the Watchtower, there were already a few people setting up. The wagons had evidently been staged the night before, and a few strong-looking people were hauling additional crates onto the carts or shuffling them from one to the other. There was a group of 3 people who Xander presumed to be the other mercenaries that would be going along with the caravan. One bushy, bearded man was dressed somewhat normally, in loose clothing that seemed like what many people he'd seen in the area were wearing, but was carrying a staff. A few small crystals were embedded in the wood near to tip of the staff, as well as small rings of steel up and down its length. It appeared as suited to being used as a quarterstaff as it might be for casting spells, so Xander was unsure what classes that one might hold. There was also a dwarf, dressed mostly in chain armor, though he had plates in a few critical places and joints. A hammer hung from his belt, and a shield was slung on their back. Some kind of melee fighter, presumably. The last member of the group was a stick-thin woman who was also the tallest of the group. She had a bow slung across her shoulders, a quiver at her side, and a small sword, or maybe it was a large dagger, strapped to the other hip. Her weaponry and the fact that she was dressed in lighter studded leather armor had Xander mark her as someone with an archery-related class. She would likely be the one Xander would be operating closest to in a fight, considering he'd prefer to use one of his guns than have to draw his sword. Not having met anyone involved in the expedition before, Xander awkwardly stood around trying to keep out of anyone's way. Eventually, the group of 3 took notice of him, though, and made a similar conclusion to his. He must be the last member of the guild-affiliated part of the expedition. "Hello there," greeted the bearded, staff-wielding man. "Would you happen to be our 4th member from the Mercenaries Guild? Dorley told us that another had signed on, said it was your first contract, too." "Hi. Yes, that's me. I'm still new to everything with the guild, so please let me know if I'm not doing something right. My name is Xander." Xander held his hand out to the man, who shook it firmly. "Atrax is the name, Fire Mage and Scholar of the Ancient. A pleasure to work with you on your first contract." Atrax gestured to his companions, first to the dwarf, and then to the woman who was standing behind him, easily looking over his shoulder. "And these 2 are Graphis, Shield-Bearer and Earth-Wielder, and Fraze, Archer, Ranger, and also a Druid of the Forest." "Greetings," Fraze nodded politely to Xander. "Howdy," rumbled Graphusis. "I like your armor. Rune work?" "Hello?" Xander echoed back. "Yes, it's something I just recently got from my class. I'm still a fairly low level, so I can't exactly do a lot of runes yet, but it's been great for armor so far. I'm an Artificer, Soldier, and Demolitionist. I could maybe do a few runes for you on the trip." 3 classes already and just starting your first contract. Things are going well for you, said Atrax. I think we can manage to help you along with the things you might not know, but we aren't going to baby you either. The best way to learn about guild work is to do it yourself, and learn from where you fell. Freze and Graphusis nodded along with Atrax in agreement. Thanks, I appreciate it. I'll try not to mess anything up too badly. Something always happens eventually. We're only mortal. What matters most is how you handle that something when it does happen, chimed in Freze. By the way, what does a demolitionist do? I make things that I can explode. I'm only level 1 in it, though, so it hasn't offered me too much yet. Right, said Graphus. Well, you just be careful where you use that. I don't want to be getting knocked on my ass in the middle of a fight or dealing with a cave-in from an explosion. Atrax is bad enough with his fireball already. I keep telling you, it's an optimal skill for clearing out clusters of enemies. This was clearly a sore spot for Atrax. Not when I'm in the cluster of enemies, damn it! Clearly, this had happened on more than one occasion. Xander smiled wanly. I'll try to watch where I throw things. I have a decent idea of the effective range of my devices. I have other, more targetable skills, too, from my soldier class, though they can be very loud. Ideally, I'll just be supporting you with my Artificer skills as we explore these ruins, though. Graphus laughed at Xander's final comment. Oh, that's funny. One thing you're going to learn about exploration contracts is that it's not a question of if you'll find something that needs to be cleared out of the area, but what you'll find. Guess I'll just have to roll with it and see what happens. Xander shrugged non-committally. He really didn't want to have to do a lot of fighting, but if it happened, then it happened. He certainly wasn't going to neglect defending himself if something happened. So what do we do while the caravan makes its way to wherever these ruins are? Mostly just play caravan guard. On the off chance there are a few bandits around or some beast or other decides we're encroaching on its territory. Shouldn't be much in the area, though. We're heading east and then south for, probably a couple weeks depending on our speed, and there's not much out there besides the normal things one might find in unpopulated woods and plains. Griffins and skeletons could be found in unpopulated woods and fields. Xander shuddered at the thought, imagining a griffin swooping from the sky to haul a man from the saddle of a horse, or skeletons shuffling towards the camp in the dead of night. Right, normal things. I'm sure we'll be fine then, he said, sounding a little unconvinced. Well, you 3 at least know the job, so I'm sure that will help. I'll try and keep up. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.